So now that we've talked about some of the differences between formative and summative assessments and what exactly they are and how they relate to your class, now we'll talk about some examples of both formative and summative and focus more on how you can use more formative assessments in your class. So this is a list of some examples from various sources like DFink and Susky. So for formative assessments, some things you can consider for your class are using projects, and these can include group projects or collaborative learning projects, where you're giving students an opportunity to practice the skills or employ the knowledge that they need before the end of class assessment, whatever the summative assessment it may be. You can give them experiments, again, that test the skills or relevant knowledge that build towards these summative experiences. And again, experiments where students are, um, determining what factors or what variables relate to outcomes in the experiment. Development of a product, asking students to develop a product and give a presentation on it, some kind of performance, where again, they're practicing skills that they may need for some kind of summative assessment. A community-based experience, or sometimes they're called service learning project, where again, you may be stopping throughout these different kinds of formative assessments to give students some kind of feedback, some kind of exhibition or a case study or critical incident, as well as a clinical evaluation. You can also consider giving an oral exam or presentation, an interview, some kind of comprehensive exam, or even a portfolio. And again, all of these can be given throughout the semester, not necessarily at the midterm or the end of the semester. And they can be used to gain feedback or give you a sense as a teacher of what the students know, what they're skilled in, and kind of what you need to build on or what you need to emphasize more, so that when they get to the end of the class, you can give them other kinds of skills to practice. On the other hand, some examples of summative assessments include a midterm exam, a final project, a paper like a term paper or a major research paper, or a recital. And again, I would recommend, if you're doing some kind of paper or recital or even a final project, building in opportunities for students to practice the skills or the knowledge that you're emphasizing in these assessments. So if you're doing a paper, maybe have them write an introduction or have them create an annotated bibliography throughout. Those would be useful. And again, you should see some kind of interplay between these two. It's not like these are only formative. These can also be used as summative exams. And, you can use a paper as a form of formative assessments, as we'll see a little bit later on, just on a maybe smaller scale. So when you are considering assessments, think about some of the following things. Make sure that you differentiate feedback from assessment, and that you provide an opportunity to give feedback, but the feedback is not necessarily the assessment. Um, Make sure that the focus is on learning and it's not just on a summative assessment or even a grade, that there is some kind of learning tied to whatever the assessment is, and encourage students to reflect on their learning and experiences in class or with this project. And I think that's a really integral part of the learning process, and it's not always emphasized enough, at least in my experience. So giving students some kind of space or opportunity to reflect on what they've learned, how they've learned, what they would do better next time. I think that's a really integral part of the learning process. Um, One other thing to consider, and I think this is kind of interesting, is to consider assessing students' prior knowledge. Um, we typically think about assessment as a post-action, but we can also use assessments as a pre-measure to assess what students come into our classes with. Um, they come from different backgrounds. They come from different schools, different experiences. They have a variety of learning experiences that can sometimes interfere with prior knowledge. I'm sorry, their prior knowledge can sometimes interfere with what we're teaching them. So it's a good idea to know about um, what students come to our classes with. So you should really consider some kind of opportunity to pre-assess before when you're planning your assessments to see what students know. And this can be, at the beginning of the school year, or this can be at the beginning of each lesson. You can give some kind of opportunity to pre-assess. Um, so some questions to consider: what facts and concepts should students know? What procedures and steps should students be familiar with? What kind of metacognitive practices should students be aware of? That is, what skills, what kind of self-awareness and study skills should students be aware of doing or knowing? And how is knowledge and skills applied in real-world concepts and problems in my discipline or in my class even? Are my assessments reflecting the complexities of the field and what students will be expected to do outside of class, or are these kind of out of context assessments? Is this not really reflecting the reality of what students know? Again, going back to this idea about prior knowledge, it's important to identify any possible gaps, interfering ideas, or even strengths that students may possess on which we can build their knowledge and ideas for our classes. So these are all questions that come from D. Fink's book about course design, and in the beginning chapters when he talks about assessment and feedback, they can really help to clarify our ideas about thinking in students' prior knowledge. One of the types of um, formative assessments that are pretty easy to administer are something called classroom assessment techniques, or CATs, developed by Angelo and Cross. And they're just quick assessments that enable both you and students to check comprehension of important information, concepts, and details for your course. They're very easy to administer and relatively easy to grade. They don't take a lot of thought. You can just kind of quickly scan through them to see where students are. So some examples of CATs: if you're trying to assess knowledge and skills of your students, one thing you can do is something called the Muddiest Point. And this is just asking students to Angelo and Cross call it the Muddiest Point. You can call it the most confusing concept. It's just asking students to identify what are some confusing ideas or problematic points in the learning. And this helps you identify areas that they may be struggling with. Another thing you can ask them to do is write a 1-minute paper, where at the end of the class you give them 1 minute and they just write down the main idea, the main concepts, what they remembered from the um, the lesson or the class. And again, it's just trying to have them organize their ideas in a succinct, um, short time frame, so it makes it easy for both of you to do. Chain notes are another interesting idea. I haven't necessarily used these, but I think they can be useful, where you prompt students to write about maybe what are some of the important concepts or ideas. You ask them to write down some things they remember, and then for a structured amount of time, very short amount of time, and then they pass it to a partner, and it's kind of like whisper down the lane with writing, so that they're generating chain notes, they're building off each other's ideas. Another thing to do, and if I don't know if you're able to do this, if you have the freedom, but to ask students to generate some test questions that they maybe use for your class. You can ask students to list things in a focused manner, so you can give them a prompt. What was the main point of this class, or list 3 important concepts that you remember from this discussion. And kind of like the 1-minute paper, um, asking students to summarize the main ideas or the concepts in 1 sentence, which is actually, I feel like, a little harder than you would think. It really challenges students to think about what they learned. Some other areas to think about if you're interested in giving students the space to reflect and self-assess, using journals or blogs or other places that you can um, use some kind of formative assessment as a quick, maybe not as quick as some of the knowledge and skills assessments, but it can give you a space to understand where students are. And then you can also ask students to respond individually to your instructional methods by giving some exam evaluations, making a suggestion box available to students, and providing some personal course feedback forms. And in my experience, you may have some course feedback forms, you may give some kind of final assessment for your teaching, but I've found that developing your own, making it, anonymous if students wish, and giving it not necessarily at the end of class or at the end of the semester, but maybe throughout the semester, like in the middle of the semester, in the middle of the session, is another way to help improve your teaching. And it gives the students a sense that you really care about what they think and what matters to them and how they learn. That's been an effective method to use. So this is the end of the presentation. Just to kind of consider, what types of assessments do you use in your class now? If you're not using any of these types of assessments, whether it's the CATs or any other kinds of formative or summative assessments, would you imagine yourself using any of them? Did any of them stand out to you? They're just some things to think about. I'm going to skip ahead to the reference pages. So again, Angelo and Cross have some different classroom assessment techniques. DFink, I pulled a lot of resources from his book, Creating a Significant Learning Experiences. It's an integrated approach to designing college courses. But I'm also going to recommend this book by Barbara Gross Davis, Tools for Teaching, which has a great amount of resources for teachers at mostly the post-secondary university level, but there are some things you can use at the high school level and other levels. So I hope you gained a lot from this presentation, and I hope that you're able to use some of these techniques in your class, because as I mentioned in the beginning of the first presentation, assessment is an integral part of course design and of teaching and learning, and formative assessment especially is helpful for both you and your students to get a sense of where your students are and where they need to go.